Hi, everybody. If anyone saw me chairing yesterday, they'll know I'm quite ruthless with time. But today it gives me great pleasure to introduce Jill Westhorpe. And like Mark did with Joe, I thought maybe I'd just start on a little personal note to say that in the last sort of 18 months, I've had the honour and the pleasure of working with Jill on the Ramesses II project. And I have to say, I've learned so much from your feedback and that I'm really grateful for having the chance to work with you. But for many of you, in a way, Jill needs no introduction. She did her PhD with Nick Tilley. So she had an excellent apprenticeship in realist methods. She's currently a professorial research fellow at Charles Darwin University, and here she leads the Realist Research Evaluation and Learning Initiative, which Jill explained to me it's so called so that she can refer to it as really, which I quite like. And the purpose of that initiative is to advance methodology and methods development. But Jill is also Director of Community Matters, which is her own business and company, where she's involved in capacity building through training and through supporting people to do realist evaluations and realist syntheses. So to me, Jill really, I suppose, embodies somebody who's done both the methods development, the capacity building, and the real-world impact of working with stakeholders in the real world to do realist evaluations. So she's the perfect person to finish up on this excellent conference by talking to us about the present, the future, and realist evaluation. Jill.
Thanks, Joe, for a very kind introduction. I want to introduce the picture on the front page before I begin. That's a photo from my current front garden, which I'm going to leave in the next few months, in a little town in the Adelaide Hills called Mount Torrens, and in particular, the little statue, I'm not sure if you can see her there, but she's positioned by the pond and she's in deeply reflective mode. And she is the first of a couple of pictorial symbols in this presentation. So I want to think a little bit about the present, the future, and realist evaluation. It's only a small topic. And when I picked it, I thought, well, that's clever because I can talk about anything and it'll fit under those headings. And then I started to develop what I was going to say, and I thought, actually, that might just be a little bit big. So what I want to think about is a handful, a snippet of developments and issues in the world around us, with a brief passing reference to some developments and issues in other forms of research and evaluation. And mainly I want to think about issues and capacities in realist research and evaluation. My working hypothesis for this presentation is that, first of all, it would be useful for realist approaches, by which I mean realist evaluation, realist review in its various forms, and realist research, to keep developing because it can make a contribution to improving knowledge that can be useful both to humans and to the planet. Secondly, that in order to do so, we have to be cognizant of all three areas, i.e. developments in the world around us, developments in research and evaluation, and developments within our own sector, and that we need to be cognizant of the issues and capacities that we need in order to develop the methodology. Given that the first two questions are obviously somewhat large, I'm going to spend very little time on those and then a bit more time on the second two. So, I am a proud and partisan realist in that I situate myself absolutely within the Pawson and Tilley camp of realists. And I'd like to start my presentation with a salute to them. I've told Nick many times that he changed my life, and he did. And so did Ray. I had the honour of working with Ray on Ramesses I as well. There have been a number of indicators in this conference already about how fast and how significantly realist approaches have in fact taken off. And this is another one. It comes from an article by Franz Liu and Stuart Donaldson in Evaluation in 2015, and Evaluation, the journal, tries to be explicitly theory-based. So they were looking at what has been referred to in what kinds of theory terms in the journal for its 20-year evaluation anniversary. And you'll see on the left that the most frequently referenced term they found was Pawson or Pawson and Tilley. And the second one after that was realist or realistic evaluation. And after that came program theory, theory of change, organisational change, and so on. Now, Ray told the story about being teased at the EES last week about having become mainstream much against his will, and Jo Rycroft Malone told us yesterday that roughly 10% of the research projects that she's currently got funded are realist studies. So I think we have to say we're here, we are part of the mainstream now. What do we need to do it better? So this first slide is taken from the book Global Megatrends, which was published by a team from the Australian CSIRO. It's the premier research and science organisation in Australia. And through a whole series of processes, they identified these 7 major trends that are shaping the present and future of the world around us. Now, there are first, and I'm not going to read them all out, I figure in this audience you can all read. There's a few things that I want to note, though. The first is that none of the trends that they've named here are single or simple phenomena. Each of them can be conceptualised as a complex system in its own right, and of course they all interact with each other. And wherever you get multiple interactions in a complex system, of course you also get unpredictability. But you might also notice that a couple of them refer to rapid. There is increasing speed of change in some of those, and that some of them are going to pull in different directions. So, for example, we have increasing demand on decreasing natural resources, but we also have increasing consumer expectations and increasing economies in the Asian and developing countries. What does that mean for us as realist researchers and evaluators? Well, one of the things that I think it suggests is that we do need to go on learning. Thank heavens it's a learning-oriented approach, and we'd better start learning faster. So in the old management maxim, fail faster and get on with it. Failure is okay, that's how you learn, fail faster. So learning in itself, however, is a complex system. It's non-linear. And a small change in learning could potentially, in fact, generate quite significant outcomes in potentially unexpected quarters. And so while Ray and others will caution us about humility in our research work and research findings, and I would wholeheartedly agree, I would also suggest that we should not be too diffident in what we do. Those who are saying, I'm not sure if I can say this out loud, I don't know if it's really realist, say it anyway. Because thinking about the implications of what you think you have learned and shouting it from the rooftops may just be the best way to contribute to something that will actually turn out to be useful to someone somewhere. And I'm going to model this by saying a whole lot of things that I know almost nothing about in the rest of this presentation. So let's also, however, take some collective responsibility for an oft-quoted phrase of part of the responsibility of evaluators is to speak truth to power. And let's speak truth to power about the limited value of us continuing to do single, unlinked, not building onto the previous piece of research and evaluations. And let's actually go and negotiate with the people who are funding us to do what Pawson and Tilley have been advocating for a long time now, which is to use knowledge that has been generated before, to accumulate and to build onto what has already been learned. Let's get serious about learning from what's gone before. The next slide, I was going to give you an introduction to transhumanist philosophy, and then I thought, just be a little bit more reasonable than that. Transhumanism is a class of philosophies, and I'm quoting, that seek to guide us towards a post-human condition. Transhumanism shares many elements of humanism, including a respect for reason and science, a commitment to progress, and a valuing of human or transhuman existence in this life. Transhumanism differs from humanism in recognising and anticipating the radical alterations in the nature and possibilities of our lives resulting from various sciences and technologies. So let's just think a little bit for a moment about what we're learning from the cognitive neurosciences. Let's think about the implications of nanotechnology for health treatment. Let's think about the various biotechnologies that are currently being developed. Let's think about what it really does mean for the world that they can, in fact, now do 3D bioprinting. That's a pretty significant change. And what's the implication of that for us in realist research and evaluation? The first is, I think we have to always remember that we are always, challenge, Andrew, we are always talking about multiple levels of systems all the time. And so we have to be thinking about the interaction of biological, social, and environmental / other real world levels in decision making. We are going to face new ethical issues. We are going to face interventions that are grounded in new sciences that probably many of us here know next to nothing about. And it's time we got used to the idea that reasoning does not just mean conscious reasoning. Reasoning in the sense of reasoning and resources doesn't just mean conscious reasoning. It means an interaction between the biological, the social, the environmental context and the choice components, all of them interacting all the time. There's research about how attachment styles affect decision making, affect use of services, and so on. There's research about how scarcity affects decision making. And I'll be coming back to those things as a methodological challenge later, so enough of that for now. But just as a little passing note, Franz Liu, Dutch realist, I was talking to him last week at the European Evaluation Society conference, and he's been involved in a €7 million programme of research in the role of neurosciences in evaluation. And there's a note on the website link that he sent me that says, many of these deal with relatively traditional interventions, but also transcranial magnetic stimulation, oxytocin interventions, and virtual reality experimental testing. And they're also linking these to applied classes and applications in relation to decision-making under pressure in the criminal justice sector, which is a lovely example of picking up what Ray was saying in his presentation yesterday about the earlier research that then should be feeding into our evaluations, and what I think is our responsibility as researchers and evaluators to think about which bits of emerging knowledge and science in other fields are actually relevant to us, and how do we help the people with whom we work, the commissioners and users of our evaluations, to become slightly more au fait with some of the implications of those emerging fields of knowledge. And here's another little example. This is about machine learning and big data. I don't recall seeing a presentation here about the use of big data in realist evaluation, but there were a number of presentations at the EES last week about big data. So because of new computing technologies, machine learning today is not like machine learning of the past. It was born from pattern recognition. Button goes off in Jill's head. Nick and Ray talk about pattern recognition all the time. We're supposed to be doing that in terms of recognising outcome patterns. We're supposed to be doing that in terms of recognising the patterns between context, mechanism and outcome. And the theory, i.e. it is a theory-based approach, that computers can learn without being programmed to perform specific tasks. Here's the primary research bit. Researchers interested in artificial intelligence wanted to find out, which led into a cycle of experimentation, whether computers could learn from data. The iterative aspect of machine learning. Oh, the computers are doing it, we'd better get good at it too. Is important because as the models are exposed to new data, they are independently able to adapt. We had better get good at learning from iterations in data and adapting as well, and helping our clients and colleagues to adapt, etc., etc. While many machine learning algorithms have been around for a long time, the ability to do it faster and faster with bigger and bigger data sets is relatively new, and it has some very significant implications. One of which is I figure we shouldn't get left too far behind the machines. However, one of the technological advances that grows from this is the self-driving car. They're not very far away. You've probably seen the ads on TV for cars with self-parking assistance. I in fact saw one last night as I was constructing this slide. And you're probably relatively used to the idea that cars come equipped with rear view cameras. They've got eyes now. You may not know yet that the pilot for the first entirely self-driving bus is currently underway. So that led me to this little thought experiment about, well, what might that mean then? And so it's going to have some pretty obvious implications in areas of labour market changes. It's going to have quick casualties in the areas where people earn their jobs through driving, like being a driving instructor or any of the professional drivers, cabbies, couriers, etc., etc. It's also going to change the nature of employment that's available in manufacture and in servicing industries for cars. It's going to have a bunch of legal implications, which I didn't have time to think through. But amongst other things, it's going to have implications for who is considered to be accountable for a road accident if there wasn't a human driving the car. And what does that mean for the insurance industry? Oh, and by the way, do we still need laws about drink driving? And how do you contemplate the car being the person who was drink driving? Then again, it might have a whole lot of social implications as well. So it might contribute significantly to independence for people with disabilities. It might depend, however, on the nature of the infrastructure that self-driving cars need, which may then constrain the extent to which, or the circumstances in which it has implications for people with disabilities. And then I thought, getting rapidly older, I wonder what the implications are for people with Alzheimer's in the not too far distant future, and whether or not we should actually be allowed to get around all by ourselves. And then I thought, it's probably going to have implications for multitasking, because I don't have to pay attention to driving the car anymore, so I can be conducting my meetings overseas at the same time. But that's only going to work for certain kinds of occupations and classes. So, i.e. the people who can afford self-driving cars are going to run into that first. So maybe what self-driving cars are going to do is increase social inequality. And then I thought, and once they've developed technology in one area, it takes off in a bunch of others, and I've got no idea what that's going to mean. And then I thought, and some of these things are outcomes, and some of them are going to be outcomes that turn out to operate as mechanisms for a whole bunch of other things later. And then I thought, so if something can be both an outcome and a mechanism, does that mean that all mechanisms are in fact invisible? Because we could see it when it was an outcome. Just a little thought. I did consider adding another subtitle to my speech, but Ray said it was bad practice. I was going to call it Multiple Cats and a Room Full of Pigeons. But anyway. So, now I want to think a little bit more about some underlying realist concepts and methods, and the idea of multiple constructs and some potential confusion. And the first point that I want to make here is that there are at least 5 brands, probably many more, of realist evaluation. And I would get myself into huge trouble if I was to try and describe what the differences between them all are. And so I'm not going to. But I want to think a little bit about some of the changes between them. So, and some of the things that were different between them. So, for example, realist anything wasn't new when Pawson and Tilley came along. What Pawson and Tilley did in the first book was apply it to evaluation. And one of the ideas that I found really important that they introduced was this notion of reasoning and resources as being program mechanisms. And within a few months of that book being published, Mark Henry and Jones had published an American version of the same book that looked remarkably similar, but placed a higher value on the role of values in realist evaluation. And then within a few years, another book had been published by Mansour Kazi. Mansour did a presentation at the EES last week in which he repeatedly described interventions as being the generative mechanisms. I couldn't disagree more, but nevertheless. And then you've got the version that's been developed by Louise Pavin over in Montreal in Canada, and she's combining Bhaskars's critical realism with French actor network theory to come up with her vision of realist evaluation. And then there are, of course, people who describe themselves as critical realists and who work in research and evaluation, who take a different axiological or political orientation than do some of us in the Pawson and Tilley camp. So what does that matter? Question, does that matter? In what circumstances does that matter? For whom does that matter? Well, I think it matters for the people who don't understand the differences between the brands and what it is that they are doing. And those people include most commissioners of realist evaluations. And I think it behoves us to make it explicit which version we're using and what that means for the nature of the questions that we will ask, the nature of the data that we will need, the nature of the answers that we will be able to provide or not provide as a result of the methods that we are using. Now, as I said at the beginning, I place myself very firmly in the Pawson and Tilley camp. That doesn't mean that I don't see ideas of value or methods of value in the other camps. It just means that's my primary orientation. But I think we have to be careful with commissioners, and I think we have to be careful when we're teaching this to students as well, that they understand what the differences really are and that they understand what they mean for practice. The second potential confusion that I want to talk about a little bit is the idea of theory and multiple constructs of theory. And I know some people here have seen this particular representation before because I use it a lot in training. It's talking about philosophy as theory, so ontology, epistemology and axiology, as Justin was introducing on Sunday morning, and formal theory or substantive theory, and program theory in its various manifestations, and evaluation theory. And of course, philosophy infuses all of the above, but you may have different philosophies infusing different ones of those. And then there I was at EES last week, and people were talking about implementation theory as being distinct from theory of change. And it took me a little while to realise that I think what they were talking about I would call theory of action and theory of change, except their version of theory of change is much more grounded in formal theory than I would necessarily have assumed. And then I thought, okay, so how is it actually that we use what kinds of theory for what kinds of tasks in realist evaluation? And this draws, so apologies to people who are at my pre-conference workshop on Sunday afternoon. I am now starting to use ideas drawn from all of those in slightly different ways in my research and evaluation programs. And particularly now that I'm working on some large and complex programs, discovering that I need multiple kinds of theory applied in multiple ways in order to be able to do theory-based work. So, within programs, for example, you can have program theory for the overarching program, but you can also have program theory for the sub-programs or components of a large and complex or complicated intervention. And that means that, for example, you can evaluate those sub-programs, or you can take a contribution analysis to what is it within the program that is contributing to generating the outcomes, and so on. You can also develop program theory for elements of theory within your program theory, and that's not a new idea. Nick and Ray have been talking about it for a long time. This is a diagram of how leadership processes and practices change and thereby generate change that we developed for the evaluation of lean in Saskatchewan in Canada. It provides a much deeper focus on the nature of mechanisms and makes it easier to identify the kinds of formal theory that you might want to draw on. It also makes it easier to identify some questionable assumptions in specific contexts. And then I started thinking about, well, hang on, because sometimes some of the questions that we're trying to answer are quite concept dependent. And Emma and I are currently working on a project in which the question asks us to deal with the issues of program fidelity and contextualisation in an organisation that does have program models but expects them to be adapted to context. And so what does fidelity mean if you expect your model to be contextualised? And how do you do good quality contextualisation if you expect some form of fidelity? And what does that mean for sustainability? And so we have these initial theoretical models that we are starting from, which just quietly don't look like CMOs, but encapsulate them. And so there's a whole lot of stuff in there. There's one box up there that says each program model needs clear program theory that identifies what makes this work, how and why. And I would like to say that came from the client, not from us. It also has a whole lot of stuff in there about the characteristics of of workers and the characteristics and practices of leaders that are required for this to work. That's going to turn out to be about mechanisms. There's a whole bucket load of stuff in there about implementation, and implementation is one of the 5 I's for thinking about context. And so despite the fact that it doesn't look like CMOs, it's going to give us a whole lot of CMO-related places to start. The client also wants us to think about whether or not this works the same or differently in fragile and developing contexts. So that's going to add another layer of consideration of context, as well as just thinking about in what circumstances is this working like this or not. And the value of this approach is that it really helps clarify some of the concepts that you're working on and identifies relationships between contexts and mechanisms, even though we haven't yet been able to go out there and do any of the fieldwork yet. Poor Emma, any minute now. So, the fourth way that I'm starting to use it is what has been labelled by the client as question theory, as distinct from program theory. So this is a very large 300 programs within the program, umpteen hundred projects within some of the programs within the program, very large approach, very learning oriented evaluation. The client wants a realist evaluation. But we simply cannot do the normal style of realist evaluation for something that is that big. And so the approach that has been negotiated is that the client and the research and evaluation team are working together to identify strategic, enduring learning questions, which we are then helping them reframe in realist terms, because they don't come out of their heads in that way, and which we are then using in order to develop the initial rough program theory, a quick dip into their internal documentation, which so far has something like 1,000 documents in it already, to develop the initial rough question theory about that question, which will then be developed and refined and further understood. There's a short product that goes back to the client when that first stage of quick dipness has been done. And they comment on that, and then there's a modified form of rapid realist review, modified because it's primarily drawing on their own literature, but also using some external literature to help develop that through. And if that doesn't give enough of an answer for the client to be able to use it for what they need it for, then that will be followed by primary evaluative research. And I think that's a manifestation of exactly what Ray was talking about in his presentation about there are ways that we can and that we should learn from the existing research and evaluation both within and across programs in order to maximise learning and efficiency and avoid reinventing the wheel. So, the last big conceptual chunk that I want to throw up is about, might cause you to, is about realism, systems, and the nature of mechanisms. And I'm going to start here with a slide that I know some of you have seen before because I put it up last year at the Leeds conference. And it's about developing mental agility in different ways of conceptualising mechanisms. So what I did to get to this slide was read a whole lot of literature about different ways that different realists have described mechanisms and the different analogies that they have used in order to try to help people to understand this idea of a complex underlying causal force, process, whatever. And of course there is the very useful, I use it a lot, construct provided by Pawson and Tilley of reasoning and resources. However, if it is the case that all systems comprise subsystems and make up elements of larger systems, as Dave Byrne was suggesting in his keynote at the beginning of the conference, and if there are causal forces at all levels of systems, and if it is a fallacy because of emergence to try to reduce the causal processes operating at one level of a system to the causal processes operating at other levels of the system, then it is also a fallacy to try and interpret all mechanisms at all levels of the system using that simple reasoning and resources construct. And therefore, I think the more we get into research and evaluation in what Andy Rowe, the developer of rapid impact evaluation, calls coupled systems, humans and environments together, or the more we acknowledge that there are all of biological, social and conscious choice-making processes involved in choice-making and decisions, then I think we have to become adept at thinking about mechanisms in ways that are appropriate to the nature of the analysis that we are doing at that time. And that simple human reasoning alone is never going to be the explanation. We need to be able to think in terms of interactions. And that is necessary for all kinds of mechanisms at all levels of all systems. So I've tried to have this conversation with a bunch of people a bunch of times, and a lot of people struggle to get past the idea of reasoning. So I've talked already about attachment and how attachment styles develop, and I'm not going to do the full explanation. But once you've developed an attachment style, and assuming that you are humans and not some new machine processing robot, you have an attachment style, because we all do. That influences the nature of how you reason. It influences how you think. It influences your stress responses. It influences your chances of getting into crime and violence, drug and alcohol addiction. It influences how you respond to services when they're provided or offered to you. There's research about how scarcity affects decision making, whether we're conscious of it or not. There's a bucket load of research into organisational learning. What do we mean by organisational learning? Actually, it's humans who learn, not organisations. Are we going to anthropomorphise the organisation? Well, on some levels of analysis, actually, I would argue it's a useful thing to do, and I don't have a problem with it. But in other kinds of analysis, it's actually a falsehood. And so we need to be thinking about, well, what do we mean about the nature of the systems within those organisations that enable them to avoid past mistakes, for example? The nature of the relationships between people, whether or not they have their own version of a mechanisms library inside the organisation. It involves a whole lot of other things, and it produces outcomes at a whole bunch of levels, not just the individual level. And then I thought, let's choose a couple of higher system level mechanisms, and found a couple of beautiful quotes, one in that same article by Lewin Donaldson that I referred to earlier. It's difficult for large groups, there's a context, to produce collective goods, that's an outcome, because of free rider, mechanism 1, and after you, mechanism 2, behaviours. Hang on, that's not reasoning, that's behaviour. I would have called that an outcome. But actually they're mechanisms that are generating outcomes at a higher level of the system. Or there was another one that I had read recently and didn't have time to go back and find the reference, so you can, smack me for it later, about the relationship between the increasing use, not just the capacity of digital communications, but their use for political organising, alongside and integrated with increasing political distrust, as changing the nature of political organising in a bunch of countries. So these are outcomes at higher levels of systems, and I think we have to abstract and think about mechanisms at higher levels to be able to do it. Jo, how am I going for time? Excellent. 7 minutes. Good. I will confess before I do this slide on statistical assumptions that I dropped out of maths at year 10 in high school, and that I would not describe myself as a quantitative researcher. However, you don't have to be a quantitative researcher to understand some of the underlying assumptions that are made in statistical methods and that are made in realism and complexity science. I am in favour of mixed methods approaches. I use statistical approaches. I usually pay somebody else to actually run the numbers, but I can do some of it so long as I've got my SPSS. But let's think about what those underlying assumptions are. For a lot of statistical methods, not all, they are assuming linear relationships between variables. They are assuming that if you change one thing, the other thing will change. If it's a straight line, it should change in the same proportion. If it's a curvilinear relationship, it will be predictable at different levels on the curve. It's assuming constant relationships. When it's done in large-scale human surveys, large-scale social surveys, it often assumes a normal distribution. The statistics assume normal distributions. My version of realism, what I learned from the people in this room, we're not talking about variables, we're talking about contexts and mechanisms, and both contexts and mechanisms are processes and they are dynamic. We are not talking about linear relationships, we're talking about emergent non-linear relationships. We are assuming that the relationships vary by context. We are assuming that the interactions between mechanisms vary by context. And I think that means we need to get together with some really clever, get together with some really clever quants to do some work on what kinds of statistical approaches can and should we use, and when do we just say, as I do in my reports now, we use this kind of a statistical analysis. It's not pure realist, but it's the best we can do, and it's providing us with some useful findings that we can then interpret in different ways using different kinds of data. Final thing. I want to think about Mark's question yesterday about a realist community of practice. And what does it take for us to think about building a realist community of practice? So I wanted to use this room full of people as being a thought experiment in whether or not realism is currently a little bit over-concentrated in particular sectors and or particular regions. So I had a look at the registrations, but that was when we had 113, as distinct from 160 or wherever, registrations. So I have to repeat the experiment. If you work in the health sector, could you please put up your hand? Oh, look at that. If you work in other than a health sector or an overlap of health and something else, could you put up your hand? Okay. Now if it's other sector exclusively, no health involved, put up your hand. Yeah.
Mutually exclusive categories.
Yes, I'm treating them as mutually exclusive categories. Health only, health overlap, other no health, just for the purposes of the exercise. I know it's not the way that that reality works. It's a heuristic, a tool. How many people here are from the United Kingdom? Have a look around. How many are not? Yeah, it's better than it was 3 weeks ago. Phew. There are very few people here from Asia. There are very few people here from the Africas. There are very few people here from America, which is interesting, given that America is a large and developed country. And so I think we, as a community of practice, if we are trying to be a community of practice, because we think we offer something of value, need to think about, well, how do we teach and how do we reach out and who do we reach out to and how do we involve people from a range of countries, a range of sectors and with a range of uses or roles, including commissioners, policymakers, service providers, academics, people who are doing in-house evaluations, people who are consultants. And how do we think about the global users? And so I want to think about how we might help a wider range of people to extract the values, the value and the values that realist evaluation, I assume we mainly or all think provides, because otherwise why are you doing it? So on this front, Charles Darwin University, where I now work part-time, would like to make a small contribution. And I am absolutely delighted to announce that next year we would like to host the next International Realist Conference in Australia. That is, of course, a tourist representation of Australia. And that is the essence of my sales pitch. Now, I was going to say it's going to be held in X city, but we're not sure yet. And I was going to say hold these dates, but we're not sure yet, but aim for October next year, just as a way to give you a timeline to think about for saving up your pennies. Next year is the 20th anniversary of the publication of the first book, Realistic Evaluation. It's not when they started the work, but it's the 20th anniversary of the book. And we want to celebrate that 20-year anniversary with a focus on the use of realist approaches. So the conference theme is From Promise to Practice. And we'll be calling for papers that focus not just on methods and findings, interesting as they are, but on the value and the utilisation of the work. And that includes, we want all the challenges, we want all the times it didn't get used, we want the times it broke, because we would like to ask the realist question about realist methods. What works for whom, in what circumstances? You should know the question by now. But we want to ask that about realist methodology. And then we want to set up some systems and structures that actually help us to have some serious conversations about those. Interesting, fun, but nonetheless useful conversations about that. In Australia, at the moment, the federal government is changing the formulas for research funding. And one of their questions, one of their new criteria is about research impact. And that has some researchers, running and screaming in horror, but I don't think it's actually necessarily a threat to us in realist approaches, because we're supposed to be interested in utilisation and impact. So we want our conference to contribute to understanding of the impact of realist approaches. And if you don't know yet how your work is being used, we would like to invite you to find out. Ring up some of your past clients and say, did you ever do anything with it? If so, what? Was there anything particular about it being a realist approach that was useful? And if so, what? And if not, why not? And what could we have done differently that would have made it more useful? So that we start to think about how it is that our work is used or not used. And in order to support that, we're going to invite you to bring 2 presenters for every paper. We know not everybody will be able to do it, but we're going to invite you to. And we'd like one of the presenters to be a researcher or evaluator, and we'd like the other presenter to be a commissioner or an end user of the research, so that we change the balance of who is present in the room. And that, if we're realist about it, should change the nature of the conversations that we have and should help us to start to think a little more about the use and utility of realist approaches. We also want to help spread the geographic focus. It's hard and it's expensive for people in Australia and Asia to get to these conferences. Your turn. Start saving now. And we also think that changing where the conferences are held is going to be useful in terms of helping to promote a geographic spread. We want to include a content focus on work that focuses on Indigenous settings and work that is working in international development and cross-cultural work using realist approaches, and some of the dilemmas that in fact creates, because there are quite a lot of them. We also finally want to use that as an opportunity for people who are doing work with people in other countries or whatever to bring meetings together. So, for example, the first project that we are going to do through, is on the development of realist economic evaluation. And there's a bunch of people from around the world who are going to be involved in that project. So we're going to hold a meeting of the realist economic evaluation crew at that meeting. And we would invite you, if you're doing methods or methodological development work that involves people from other places, to say, we'd like a room, we'd like to have a meeting, and maybe we'd like to have a pre-conference meeting and then present some of our conversations into the conference, or whatever it might be. We do recognise that Australia is a long way away. And we know that there is an enormous diversity of things that you could do while you're there. So back to the original sales pitch. I'd like to acknowledge at this point my partner in crime in this adventure, Emma Williams, who is, her project is called ECI, which is Evaluation and Knowledge Impact. I tried really hard to make her put the word realist in there, research in there, so it could be evaluation and research knowledge impact, because then between us we could be really irky. But we will be your hosts for this conference next year, and we really hope that you can really come. This conference has been absolutely fantastic. Again, it's the third of 3 really good realist conferences. I'd like to bow in honour and thank Justin and the other people who've contributed to organising it. And I really hope that we can do half as well next year. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Jill. That was an excellent and thought-provoking presentation. Lots of food for thought. So we've got around 20 minutes or so for questions. Justin's got a few microphones. So who would like to ask Jill a question?
Or argue with her, please.
Yeah.
It's your turn to argue back.
Someone here? If you introduce yourself as well, although we might all know each other by now.
Right, okay, I'm Danny White. I'm from the Social and Public Health Sciences Unit in Glasgow. That's really fantastic, thanks very much. And it's not often you go to a conference where the final presentation is as full as any of the others were all along. So I think that reflects your standing in this area. Okay, that's a nice bit. The next bit is to point out
I knew it was coming, Danny. I knew it was coming.
That there seems to be a bit of a disconnect in how you started and then how you finished in your talk. Yeah. Because you presented a fascinating list of 7 major trends that we ought to be aware of, which include increasing demands on decreasing natural resources and the importance of global climate. And then you conclude by urging us all to travel across the world to Australia. and I think most academics like to think that climate change is primarily attributable to big corporations and evil countries that pump out lots of coal, for instance. But we all contribute in a massive way through our air travel. So given that you are clearly well aware of new technologies and really interested in those, is there any way that this conference could be a teleconference which would have obviously a core in Australia, but have clusters around the world to save people having to travel there, but also to make it more accessible to people who don't have loads of resource funding?
You didn't know you were going to end up on the conference planning committee just by asking a question, did you? I don't know is the honest answer. I don't know whether we can do it. I don't know whether we can organise it in time. I absolutely take your point. And in fact, one of the prime drivers for the university, as distinct from me, in offering it in Australia is in fact so that people who can't usually get here can come. But I think a lot of the value of the learning that comes out of conferences is through the human interaction. I do a lot of my work using remote technologies because my clients are all around the world. It just doesn't work the same. So yes, I understand that it's a contradiction. Yes, it's something that we could look into in terms of some additional ways. Whether we can pull it off in time for next year, I don't know. It might be a question for the next CARES conference as well. Back to you, back into your forecourt, Justin. I'll think about it, Danny, and I will be in touch. Yeah.
I've got a comment, then a question. Oh, sorry, it's Andrew Hawkins from Australia. We have, for the last 3 years or so, run a virtual book club around realist evaluation using the internet. And we're wondering whether we should expand it beyond Australasia or whether people in the UK might want to do their own one or something like that. So quite a few of us have done that over the years. We just read an article and then come together and chat about it on Skype, and it works reasonably well. Might totally change the pitch on the thing, though. One of the points that you made, I thought was very interesting, the whole thing, but you talked about some of your outcomes turn into being mechanisms in other contexts. And you said we could see it when it was an outcome. So if it's now a mechanism, does that mean all mechanisms are invisible? First, can you give me an example? And secondly, because often doing outcomes hierarchies with clients, one of the things we say, often the outcome is not actually visible. It's the proxies or the indicators or attributes of those outcomes that are the concrete manifestations that we can see. And so that's what we measure. And is it the same, or can you give me an outcome that's actually observable?
Sure. It was carefully constructed into the slide, actually. I deliberately chose one outcome, which you can measure, but which you can also see. And it was drink driving. You can't necessarily see, but you can certainly measure, because you can measure the alcohol in somebody's blood. But you can also see, if the car's driving itself, drink driving might take on a whole bunch of new connotations, like it's no longer illegal to sit in the car and have a drink. And that is observable.
But Jill, drink driving is different to a prescribed concentration of alcohol offence.
Sure.
DUI
Wait. Just let me finish question one before you ask the next one. And the higher level outcome to which I am arguing that operates as a mechanism, whether it's directly observable or whether it's just measurable, because I actually think that doesn't matter all that much, is potential for higher levels of violence, potential for changes in the nature of health impacts, potential for those to be differentially distributed according to who decides that they will drink in the car and whether or not that's on the way to work or on the way to a party or, all context. So I'm not actually offering an answer. I think that there are a huge range of social processes that are not directly observable, that are context in some circumstances, mechanism in other, and outcome in other. And that we therefore, but the note of warning is, some outcomes are observable and or measurable, and if they can also then contribute to other other outcomes at higher levels, and they are part of the causal process. Now, my own rebuttal to myself is, are they mechanisms or are they part of a causal process, and does it matter? So I don't know the answer. I'm posing the question because I think we need to grapple with it for the philosophical reasons that I said immediately before that. If all systems are embedded, if it is a falsehood to reduce, because of causation, the powers and liabilities of a system to those of its component parts, then I think we need to be thinking about mechanism in ways other than or in addition to. My personal hypothesis is that one of the reasons that people struggle to get beyond reasoning is that there is an element of reasoning or human stuff in the social mechanisms. But I think we run the risk of being reductionist if we stop there and not paying enough attention to what the other causal contributors are. And that's really my main message.
I agree with that one.
It had to happen eventually that Andrew and I would agree about something.
Thank you. Any other? There's some at the back. And then there's one there as well.
Sorry, Jill, it's Suzanne. Just a quick question. Have you thought about Bayesian statistical techniques? Just because they're based on hypothesis generation, testing hypotheses. And it occurred to me as I was hearing you talk that might be a way to go.
Let me start again with how I dropped out of maths at year 10. I haven't, but anybody who didn't drop out of maths at year 10 who might like to give that a thought. Again, I'm offering it as a challenge. I don't think, not as a challenge, as a future direction. It's something to come to terms with. And no, I haven't thought about it, but I'm glad that you now are.
Okay, there was someone else who had their hand up there.
Hello, Katie Shen, Sheffield Hallam University. I was actually going to make the same point, not because I know anything about Bayesian statistics, but my supervisor, Dr. Peter Allmark, who is actually a philosopher, is thinking through the philosophical implications of, or the possibilities of using Bayesian statistics. So that's, I think from Realism Leeds, there was also another lady there that was presenting about possibilities of using statistical modelling to support realist work. And the other comment I was going to make was just about the definitions and the shifting sands between mechanisms and context. And I find it useful to go back to Andrew Sayer, who talked about the internal, I think it's from Bhaskar originally, the internal necessarily relations within an object, which has capabilities and liabilities, capacities and liabilities, as a sort of proxy for a mechanism, and the external contingent phenomena that triggers that as a proxy for the context. And that helps me get away from the one-level thinking.
Yeah. I agree, and I've tried playing around with it myself, except that I find the number of words in the phrase, while I'm trying to think two things at once, difficult. The issue then becomes, where are you putting the boundaries around the system? So acknowledging that it is always us who are putting the boundaries around a system. They don't operate that way in the nature of reality. Then what is internal and external to the system, where are you drawing the boundaries, becomes the question that you have to solve. And then you can think about internal, external. I think that changes depending on the quote-unquote moment of analysis is what I talk about. So where you're drawing the boundaries in the system may also shift over the course of an evaluation or a research question. Ray's got the microphone. Am I allowed to run away and hide now?
No, I want to start by congratulating you on the journey that you are about to take from Pawson and Tilley realism. And you're quite right. It began by us thinking of very specific, localised programmes like CCTV, like prisoner education. And you're absolutely right that you should head realist evaluation off into these highly complex systems within systems processes, because that's where lots of policy changes is operating. So if realist evaluation fails to go there, we're done. However, I'd like you to remember the struggles of the little old local evaluator. People have bumped into me at the conference, worried to death. This is PhD students, about the question you've come across already. Is this realist form evaluation? Is it really realist? To which I've tried. I tried to apply soothing balm and said it's likely to be a partial realist evaluation, because you, poor PhD student, you won't be able to get this information you anticipated because your policymaker doesn't want to talk to you, your programme will die, etc., etc. So you only ever, in my view, investigate a partial piece of a system, even a small one. So I'm a bit worried about the huge ambition of taking. I can't even recall any of your diagrams, but they were so complex. The chance of you interrogating every interrelationship is small. So
vanishingly small.
The big problem is choosing the parts.
Yeah.
And there's no recipe for doing that. But is there anything you can just say about that?
Well, I could say many things in response to that. First of all, I still actually do small-scale local evaluations as part of my work. These days I choose them because they're going to let me think about a particular method. When I did my PhD, and Nick will remember this well, my title was Developing Realist Methods for Small-Scale Community-Based Evaluations, sub-brackets, that have poor quality outcomes data, because I thought that was all I was ever going to get to work on, was small-scale local evaluations. The big one that I referred to in that, where we're developing strategic enduring questions, is the evaluation of the British government's International Climate Fund, which is neither small-scale nor local. So, do we think that we're going to investigate all aspects of any of those? Absolutely not. Do I think that we need to have the faith in ourselves and the philosophical underpinnings of the method to believe that we can develop approaches that will be policy useful for bloody big questions? Excuse my slip into Australianism there. Yes, I think we can and we should, and I'm not challenging ever that we will ever. I didn't mean to suggest that we would ever come up with a complete answer to anything. The other thing that I would say to every PhD student in the room is I don't believe I've ever done a properly realist evaluation, and I've done nothing but realist work since 2002. So if I'm allowed to, you're allowed to. And for those of you who are still in process of doing your PhDs, on the day of my Viva, the final exam, my examination panel were in England, I was in Australia. It was the morning for them, it was the evening for me. I spent all day walking around the house saying to myself, when they fail you, you're not allowed to drop out tomorrow. You have to reconsider and give yourself 24 hours, and before you withdraw, you might be able to fix it. And I wonder if I get it. And I drove Nick and Ray mad for 2 or 3 years after that, saying, so do you think I get it? Because I wasn't sure whether I got it. So that sense of I'm not sure if I really get it takes time to sink in. The changing of the nature of the way that you think takes time to sink in. But these days, when people say to me, why do you call yourself a realist evaluator? You should use whatever method is appropriate for the nature of the questions. I now proudly say, I don't call myself a realist evaluator. I call myself a realist. Because that is the way I think causation works. That is what I believe about the nature of knowledge. It's always partial, it's always incomplete, it's always culturally determined, and it is always constrained by that mind-independent reality out there. And I choose to work in realist evaluation because it contributes to knowledge, and I value knowledge. So I would say, yes, all of us, in our own little ways, are going to contribute one more drop in a big ocean of knowledge, and that's enough. But let's not constrain ourselves by thinking in ways that we have been taught, only in ways we have been taught to think. Let's take the ways we have been taught to think and see if we can move them into other socially useful domains, is really my main message.
Wow, that sounds like a really lovely way to end the session. Thank you so much. So we are now approaching the very, very last session of the conference. And I think what I'd like to do is take a 5-minute break. So you can just sit in your chairs, or if you just need to go have a refreshment break, just for 5 minutes. And then we'll come back at 1. And from 1 to 1:30, it's just another open mic, but it's different than yesterday's open mic in the sense that it's not going to be this sustained engagement. It's just going to be comments or questions that are still left unanswered that we will carry forward. So it's not about resolving anything. It's just about your opportunity to provide feedback, to provide your perspective on things, any comments you have, and just to keep raising the questions that still arise in your head. So please stay with us. It would be lovely from 1 to 1:30. So you have about 5 minutes if you want to just get up and stretch, and we'll come back for that. Thanks.